Welcome to the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Melanie Jackson. I'm a clinical and research midwife with my PhD, and each episode I cast a critical eye over current maternity care practice by grappling with research and historical knowledge to help you get the best out of your pregnancy, birth, and postpartum journey. Welcome to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. Today I'm joined by my guest, Dr. Sarah McKay, who's a neuroscientist with a special interest in how women's brains work and change through their unique life stages. And today we're exploring the neuroscience behind how pregnancy and motherhood sculpt our brains and change our minds.
For the better.
For the better. Exactly. I'm glad you added that. So we get an upgrade. Our brains change for the better. And before we start on all of that, Sarah, can you introduce yourself, your qualifications in your work?
Okay, so, I have a PhD in I've got 3 degrees in neuroscience, I should say. So I've got a Bachelor of Science honours degree in neuroscience from Otago University in New Zealand, because I grew up in New Zealand. And then I have a Master's in neuroscience and a DPhil, which is from Oxford University, and a DPhil is just the fancy Oxford University way of saying PhD. So, Bachelor's, Master's and PhD all in neuroscience. And mum, I suppose book author. I just turned 50, so I feel like that's a qualification.
It's a qualification for what?
Have always, literally met and fell in love with neuroscience in first year uni in 1993. Thought it, was really cool learning about synapses. I was just like blown away by that little biological mechanism. Yeah. And one of the reasons why I still love neuroscience, although I'm not an academic researcher anymore, is that it's still cool to find out new things about the brain and how it works. And luckily, what I have focused in on, which is around women's health across the lifespan, there's lots of people that want to talk to me about the stuff I find cool. So that's how I spend my time. I've spent a lot of time in the last few years writing. Last year I wrote 2 books. Don't write 2 books in 1 year. It is a lot of work. I literally had like 12 hours between submitting one and starting the next. And I've written in the last few, and Baby Brain came out in 2023. I've updated a lot of courses that I teach. Wrote 2 books last year. So I'm taking a gap year. Turned 50 at the beginning of the year. And so I'm taking like a little gap year, except I'm doing podcasts and things because that's kind of fun. Yeah, I'm doing like watercolor classes. I'm like going to dog training. I'm going to the gym. I might learn to play pickleball. I don't know. I'm just having a year to just take my foot off the accelerator because the last few years I've just been doing too much and trying too hard.
Try too hard. But thankfully your brain is upgraded to its optimum format.
Well, yeah, I think it might be just it's kind of reached its limit. So it needs to reset. Yeah.
I love that you're getting a gap year and doing things. I took up banjo this year and knitting. So I can crochet very well, but I thought I'm going to learn some new things too. But can you tell me the names of the books that you've written?
So the first book, I don't love the name. I didn't want to call it that. However, it is called The Women's Brain Book, The Neuroscience of Health, Hormones and Happiness. I wanted to call it All in Her Head. However, the publishers at that time, the marketing department, thought, it's a bit like The Girl on the Train or The Woman in the Window. So they thought All in Her Head might sound a bit too much like domestic noir.
Sure.
Not like neuroscience. So that was a bit disappointing. But that's okay. The second book then, so that was 2018, beginning of 2018 that came out. Then in 2023, I published Baby Brain, which we have already said, the surprising neuroscience of how pregnancy and motherhood sculpt our brains and change our minds for the better, 2023. And then earlier this year, so the first half of last year, I spent writing Brain Health for Dummies, which is part of the For Dummies brand. So that's just come out in the last month or 2. And the second half of last year, because there has been so much new cool neuroscience in women's health, I felt like the Women's Brain Book needed an upgrade. it needed to be updated with all of this new neuroscience, because I was starting to get a little bit, not embarrassed, but I'd hand it over to people and go, oh, but there's so much new stuff and some of it's outdated, and like read some of it, but not all of it. And so then I thought, I'm just going to update that. So I spent the second half of last year updating that. So the updated version of that with the same title, but a different cool new cover, comes out in July this year.
Brilliant. I love that.
So I say there's 3.5 books.
3.5 books. That's 3.5 more than most of us. So hats off. Tell me, what's your along with the little bit of research that I did about you before kicking off this podcast episode, what's your familiarity with Andrew Huberman of
Andrew Huberman. I was like, what's she going to say? My familiarity with him. So,
like, what are you?
Back in last century. So my PhD topic was looking at this sort of development of the visual system, very early postnatal development of the visual system, and I was really interested in how neurons and the visual pathway wire up very early in development and what kind of guides those connections. So is it like nature? Is it nurture? And when it comes to visual system, is it like completely genetic, or is it determined by actually what we see? Does seeing guide visual system development? And so his PhD was at the same time on a very similar topic. And then I went to like neuroscience summer camp for PhD students, which is so nerdy, but was very cool. I do like a little excursion with fellow scientists. But so I went to Cold Spring Harbor Lab in Long Island near New York, where they run like science camp for academics. And I did structure and function of the visual system. And Andrew Huberman was also doing the same program. So we spent about 3 weeks hanging out. And so I met him then. And then later that year, then I went back over to the US, and we hung out a bit more doing neuroscience, going to a conference. And then I went back and had Thanksgiving at his mum's house, which was very nice of him to put me up there. And then we kind of kept in touch briefly because we were both doing same topics, and then lost contact, but then like kind of reconnected again a few years ago before he became famous. Wow. And he did some teaching on one of my, because I run online professional development courses, and he did some teaching on one of my courses. And then one day he said, I think you're starting a podcast. And I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. I think there's a market for people talking about neuroscience. Said you'll probably do quite well. And now, like, you can't even ring him up on the phone. Like, it's like trying to get hold of. It's like trying to get hold of the king or something.
Yeah, he's proper famous now. So really,
yeah, it's kind of wild how he's done really well.
Yeah,
done very, very well.
Fantastic, amazing.
So that's my Andrew Huberman story. I just would like to add that there was never any romantic connection, because people seem to think that because we went to summer camp together, there must have been never a touch. I was already dating my now husband at the time. It's professional friendship only.
Fantastic. I assumed as much.
People always like the juicy gossip. There's none.
No, you're just friends. That's completely fine. All right. So today we're going to talk about the topic of matrescence. And can I just say that Google and spell check don't recognize matrescence as a word yet?
No, it doesn't. No, it's the best word. I wish I had known that word when my boys were little, because they are now 15 and 16, turning 17. And had I known that word 16, 17 years ago, I think things would have sometimes one word can just shift your way of thinking. I thought then, and I don't even think the internet was a thing then, but there wasn't that much information out there about this. I thought that you had a baby, you got pregnant, and it was this event, and then you had the baby, and that was another kind of event, and then you looked after the baby, and it was, some parts were great and easy, and other parts were like the hardest thing I've ever done. And had I known that matrescence and kind of encompassed that whole process as a journey of becoming, and had I known it was neurological and social and spiritual and psychological and physical and all of the things, in the same way adolescence is, like we can say matrescence is a bit like adolescence, then I think I just would have given myself a whole lot more grace because I was pretty tough on myself and I found it hard, and I thought that I shouldn't find it hard. And people didn't talk then about how it was hard.
Mm.
And had I known that matrescence was a process of becoming, then I think it would have given me insights into that, what was happening.
A growth process, not
a failure, not a problem to be solved, not a thing I didn't manage to do right.
Yes. And I love that inference that you make in your book that matrescence is like adolescence. And society recognizes that it's a huge transition for children to go from being children into adolescence and the amazing changes that happen in their body and their brains. And you talk about matrescence, it's the maternal version.
Yeah, I didn't know that, because I always said, parenting, like the easy part with the babies, because my boys are very straightforward, and I didn't, I had very straightforward pregnancies and deliveries and straightforward babies who ate very well and slept very well, and they were, by all accounts, what you would say easy. But it was so hard.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't them that was hard, it was me that was hard. I didn't like I couldn't understand who I was and what I was doing and why I felt so different.
Right.
Because I didn't know that was part of the process. I thought it was just like having a new friend.
Yeah, look up.
Like that you looked up. I don't know what I was thinking. Like you meet someone and they're just this new person in your life. It doesn't alter every cell in your body.
Let's talk about the altering of cells in your body. So from what you know of neuroscience, what happens to us when we get pregnant?
Yeah. So in short, the way I like to sum it up is that pregnancy prepares the mind for motherhood. So we are very familiar with the idea that pregnancy, and then, you deliver a baby and then you nurture the baby, that a large part of what happens to your body is growing the baby, but then also preparing your body to nurture the baby, so if you choose to breastfeed. But that process is also shaping and sculpting your brain, a process that we're very familiar and comfortable with talking about happening to other animals, other mammals, and we're just biological mammals too. So the process of pregnancy doesn't just shape our bodies, it actually shapes and sculpts our brain. And a lot of the shaping and sculpting and changing that takes place in our brain, the neurological shifts and changes take place during pregnancy. We now understand that, and they're driven largely by the hormones of pregnancy. And they completely reorganize the brain and even change it structurally with the intention, because we understand which networks change, of being able to respond and nurture and care for your baby. We know that it's about responding to the baby's cues and needs and wants, because the parts of the brain that change most, all the parts of the brain change, but those that change most are involved with social cognition or reading social cues. So what someone else is thinking or what someone else is feeling. I mean, you don't really need, pregnancy isn't changing your brain, so you need to worry about what your boss thinks or feels. It's to keep your baby alive. The evolutionary mandate is to keep this new baby alive, so your brain has changed to enable you to do that. We are largely social creatures, and we also learn how to parent. Not all of knowing how to take care of a baby as a human mammal is innate. The baby doesn't pop out and we know what to do. We need to learn how to do that from other people. But I think that what the intention, and I'm using those words loosely, Mother Nature's intention, is that the learning curve is a little less steep, because our brain is kind of being primed to learn how to respond to our baby's cues. Yeah. That is in much the same way as every other sort of mother, particularly in the mammalian kingdom that we have studied. We know that pregnancy shifts their brains so that they deploy the appropriate kind of maternal behaviours. We can talk about maternal instinct and what that means, because that's a very loaded term, but the appropriate parenting behaviours to keep that baby alive. What we've now, it started in 2009, the research, but it started being published about 2017. So we've kind of got 8 years now. It's not a lot actually of research in this maternal brain space. And it's continually new stuff is coming out all the time. New research is always emerging. There's really cool women involved with doing that research. Yeah, we're now understanding the specifics about the brain structural reorganization, what's driving it, and kind of why. And I mean, it's the why is for the baby, really.
Of course. I mean, we're entering into a new phase of life.
Yeah.
And need a new brain for it.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what I said. It's not like getting a new friend who's just like hanging out in the house with you. Really, you need to be doing nothing else except focusing in on that baby to keep it alive. Much and all as we think we're still going to keep on doing all of the other things that we've always done and nothing will change, there's some neurological shifts.
So we're growing. It's not just our uterus that changes, and we're not just pumping blood to this tiny little baby while it grows, while we're pregnant. Our actual brain is changing. You said the whole brain changes.
Yeah. The first studies that came out, which have got a really cool origin story, which I can talk about, were looking at just the structure. They were like doing brain scanning studies, so like MRI. Like, let's look at a group of women before their first pregnancy. Very important that they haven't been pregnant before, and the same group of women after that first pregnancy. It's actually really hard to do because you scan a woman who isn't pregnant yet, and then she has to actually go away and get pregnant. And then you scan her afterwards, and that process isn't always, as everyone knows, isn't always straightforward. So to get enough women to run a study, and you didn't scan her brain and then have to wait 5 years for the baby. It's hard science to do, but we're getting better at that now. This field is blossoming. And so looking at the structure of women's brains before and after that first pregnancy, we could see that the parts of the brain, particularly the grey matter, which is kind of like the wrinkly grey matter, if you were looking at a whole brain, you're holding it in your hands, what you kind of see on the outside has got slightly thinner, particularly in parts of the cortex involved with social cognition. Now, that sounds like, oh, my brain is dissolving or is, diseased or is dysfunctional. But we see the same during adolescence. So that's why I said adolescence is a bit like matrescence, when as a very normal, healthy part of brain development during teenagehood, the brain gets slightly thinner. And we understand very well from teenagers, both looking at animal models and looking at humans, that is involved with the emergence of new behaviours and new skills, like growing up and becoming a bit more of a capable human. And that's a process of pruning and fine-tuning of the connections in the brain. And the brain almost becomes streamlined. And that's a much better way of thinking about pruning and tuning and streamlining versus degeneration. So when we say shrinkage, that implies loss. Whereas when it comes to the brain's volume change, volume loss can sometimes mean it's kind of improving. It's like kind of getting leaner and meaner. And so we think the same thing is happening in the pregnant brain. Overall, what we see, the difference between before and after that first pregnancy, we see a 4% volume loss, which is actually quite a lot. 4% doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a lot when it comes to an event that takes place in the brain. And like we scan the brain immediately after the baby's born, and then we scan it a few months later, you see a little bit of a bounce, like the brain kind of bounces back. But the changes remain enough that if you were to scan the brains of women in their 80s, we've now got enough data to say mother, not mother, mother, not mother. So the changes are permanent.
So it doesn't just change in its function. It's not like it fires differently. It actually physically looks different.
It physically looks different in that the grey matter is slightly thinner. Like if you were just to look at it, it would look slightly thinner, which might look like degeneration, but it's not. It's streamlined. It does also function differently as well. So we can look at the structure of a brain, but we can also look at the function of a brain. So we can take a photo of its structure, or we can take a video of it in action and look to see how does one part of the brain communicate with another. So we're looking to see often how efficient the different networks in the brain, like how well organized are they, how easily do they connect and communicate. And interestingly, if you look at a new mother's brain, a lot of those networks are actually far more efficient and flexible and well connected. So the entire focus, which I'm trying to change away from talking about motherhood and brains as being just like one of dysfunctional, emotional kind of foggy messes, is actually, if we look at it objectively, that brain is far more efficient and well connected and is actually working better than it did before it had the baby. We can see the function change as well. What they have tried to do is look to see, do the structural changes relate to the functional changes? And so they've done some kinds of studies where they're able to look to see how responsive is the mother to her new baby. Not necessarily around attachment, because that's, again, a loaded term, but, if a mother's like listening to sounds of her baby cry versus another baby's cry, how like strongly is her brain reacting? The brains that have changed more structurally also have a stronger functional response. So there's definitely an underlying reason for that. It's enabling us to tune into the baby. I would love this data to come out. This is from rats and mice. But everyone who hears it goes, oh, I reckon it's in humans too. There is some work in rats and mice that's looking at hormones postpartum, in particular oxytocin, which we know is involved with breastfeeding and like love and cuddles and snuggles and attachment with the baby. In rats and mice, oxytocin changes the wiring in auditory cortex, so the part of the brain that hears things. So a baby mouse's cry is like ultrasonic. It's so high pitched you can't hear it. In fact, adult mice can't hear baby mice crying unless they're lactating. And it's the oxytocin that has changed the auditory cortex so it can hear the baby cry. So what happens when you have like a new baby and like you're asleep at night and then you hear the baby's eyelids open before it even cries, like you wake up. I reckon that oxytocin is doing something to our sensory perception and input. Maybe our auditory cortex is so finely tuned to our baby. I don't think we hear its eyelids open. I'm being a bit silly, but it doesn't take much to wake you up and to tune into the baby. We've got some data that shows that the processing in a brain of a new mother is responding much quicker to the sound of a baby crying, particularly her own baby, than a brain that's not a mother.
The few things that really stuck out to me was firstly that a lot of the research seems to be less than 10 years old. Have we even done any of this?
Yeah. It's super new. Yes.
New. I mean, so I was a midwife 6 years before the very first research came out on this, so I wouldn't have even been told that in my training.
No.
So what you're saying is when we get pregnant, our brain, obviously our body reorganizes itself in lots of different ways in order to grow a baby, but our brain does the same thing, and on an elementary level, we see reduction in grey matter, and that's not about less function in the brain. It's what you called prune and tuning. Yeah, so we almost get
the brain is like, it's almost like prioritizing various tasks over others. It's prioritizing us to respond to the baby.
Right. And so a reduction in volume of grey matter, it doesn't mean a reduction in function or, that we're less brainy.
Correct.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And the timing about you being a midwife is interesting because the first paper that was published was end of 2016, early 2017. But the idea for that came out in 2009. So that's how long it takes to do science a lot of the time. And I have to tell this story because it's a very cool story. It's these three Spanish women, one Dutch, Elselina Hoxemat, and Erica Barbara Muller, and a woman, Susanna Carmona, who's done such an amazing job leading this field. And they were like just driving a car off to the pub to celebrate Erica's honours thesis or master's thesis that she'd submitted. And then they said, what are you going to do next in life? She says, I might have a baby. And then they went, what will happen to your brain? Ha, ha, ha. And then they started going, what will happen to your brain? And they worked in a brain imaging lab. And then it was 2009. What would you do now? You look on your phone. You start reading the research on your phone. But it was 2009. You couldn't read research on your phone then. So they turned the car around and went back to the research lab. They didn't even go to the pub. They didn't hate the pub. They went back to the lab and then started because they wanted to they were so captivated by the idea, and they started going through the research and they were going, there's nothing. There is literally nothing. There's a little bit on animals. And so then they were like, well, why don't we do the study? And so then they stayed up all night and they literally designed the study. They said, we're going to get women who've never had a pregnancy and could scan them before and after. And so they ended up scanning themselves. At the time, none of them had babies. And then they were like, we need a control. And so they scan these were all heterosexual couples, and so they scan the father's brains as well, which has proven to be super interesting in its own right.
Yeah.
Looking to see what happens with the male brains. And now they've just recently published a study where they've got lesbian couples. So they've got like the mother who's given birth, and then they've got the other mother who didn't give birth but went through that whole process to like do that kind of comparison. So they've done a lot of research, and it almost blasted open the door of this like entire new discipline. They're still putting new stuff out all the time. And there's just so many cool women, and there's mostly women involved in this space doing this research. Some of the newer stuff that's published, a lot of it, it's like this kind of like really pioneering research, like kind of Marie Curie. They're doing the experiments on themselves. So one woman, she was in a brain researching group, and she said she knew she was about to go through IVF, and she said to her friends, why don't we scan my brain through my pregnancy, because we'll know the exact date I'm going to fall pregnant. And it was successful. So we'll know the date of conception. And then they were able to scan her brain at multiple points through her pregnancy, which is very hard to get ethical approval of to do on other people. But she was informed enough to be able to do that. And they took her bloods every day that they scanned her. So they've got this, like, they call it dense sampling. So they've now got this brain scan of this one woman's pregnancy. And that's all open access data. So that data is all now being shared.
Yep.
So we're now able to see exactly when in pregnancy the changes start to happen and take place, mostly in the third trimester, mostly correlated with estrogen levels. And then there's some really wild data, which hasn't been picked up more broadly, and perhaps for some people is uncomfortable, and that women who've had labour and delivery versus women who didn't have any experienced labour, the structural changes are greater. It's almost like labour and delivery, as they say, gives the final push of plasticity. It kind of makes those changes bigger, the structural changes bigger, which is essentially the brain responding to the hormones of labour and delivery in that process. The brain has responded to that. It's not to say it makes the brain better. It's just the brain has responded to that as well. So there's so much exciting new work coming out.
I did read all about that study. That one was called Pregnancy Leads to Long-Term, Long-Lasting Changes in Human Brain Structure. And I guess, partly I want to highlight to people that this was the first, 2016.
Yeah.
And so if you've never heard this before, this is why.
Yeah.
We knew that pregnancy is spectacularly transformative of women's bodies, but it's the same of women's brains. And as you're saying, labour and birth is all part of that transformation as well.
Yeah, and it was women in these positions asking these questions and being able to get the funding and being able to do the studies that have driven the field as well. No one was asking the questions before, because and I think it's almost like it's a generational shift that we've seen in the last 10 years of women working their way up kind of in the research fields and being able to ask questions at it. But we've got thousands of studies on left-handedness.
I know. Do you know, I was mortified. I'm currently doing some researching for some podcasts on preeclampsia, and the number of research papers that talk about the importance of the women having exposure to their partner's sperm by any means outnumber some of the other more important topics. And I'm like, how did we get so many papers on the importance of exposing yourself to male sperm? And we still have really only recently discovered not only that women's bodies and brains change in pregnancy, but, you know, things like the anatomy of the clitoris is pretty brand new as well.
When I wrote my first book along those lines, I was writing about the neurobiology of orgasms, which was rather interesting. And then I was like, oh, multiple orgasms. Like, surely there's a basic neural circuit there involved with the repetition in women versus habituation in men. And I found about 3 or 4 papers on it, and 3 were on multiple orgasms in men.
Right.
They weren't even looking in the biological sense where they happen. They were trying to figure out how they could make it happen where it doesn't. Of course they were. You've just got to laugh. That said, because I'm an eternal optimist, I just find it exciting that the research is now emerging at a time when I just get to watch it on from the sidelines and share it on, instead of it all being done 30 years ago and
Yes.
It's contemporary and it's new and it's exciting, and so I'm just a bit selfishly grateful that it's happening now.
I think it's great. And I mean,
Yeah.
this even came out before. So I finished my PhD in 2014, and I actually was doing it while I was pregnant. And I
Wow.
remember, I felt the change occur in me where I literally just wanted to crochet and watch cartoons. And I thought, what is going on? I was usually
You were nesting.
absolutely. I thought, but I was capable of writing a PhD, but not in that moment.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, women describe baby brain, but what is baby brain?
Oh, I've got many thoughts on this. That's why I called the book Baby Brain.
Yeah.
So I'll caveat by saying I never experienced it. However, I didn't know it was a thing. And I had boys, and there's like one weird study saying mums of boys are less likely to experience memory loss than mums of girls. But that's never been replicated. So I don't know. I went into this not experiencing it. And so I did take a little bit of my bias in there, which I've tried very hard to shake off over time. Because lots of women experience it. And I was really interested in what it was and is it real and what's the evolutionary kind of mandate for becoming forgetful. So baby brain is this, how women would experience, describe, not so much like what you were doing, which I would call more like nesting, just kind of wanting to be cozy and just kind of at home. And there's a drive to isolate yourself because it's biologically, you don't want to get infections and stuff before you have the baby. That's a woman on a kind of nest, and that's, healthy and be expected in some cases. But baby brain is more about feeling forgetful and foggy and not being able to pay attention and not being able to remember all of the things and using the wrong words or not remembering names or putting your purse in the fridge, all of the stories that you hear. I think it's really important, though, to look at it in terms of during pregnancy and then after pregnancy, because they're entirely different neurological and physiological states. But we tend to use them colloquially across both. So I was kind of interested in that and kind of interrogating them separately. So first I looked at, not me, I looked at the data that other people have explored, looking at what do we see during pregnancy. The best way to do any kind of study is a longitudinal study, is to take a big group of women and follow them before pregnancy, during pregnancy, and after pregnancy, not comparing a group of pregnant women here and a group of non-pregnant women there. You've got to look at how one woman or a large cohort kind of change. And all of the large cohort studies that have tested memory and attention and all of these different cognitive skills before, during, and after don't find any kind of alterations. We're not picking up any objective changes in memory whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of interesting, because if you say to the woman, look, here's your test scores, she'll go, well, I don't believe you. Because I feel different, but objectively the test scores aren't. So there's something going on there. If we look at just during pregnancy, some studies do find in the third trimester, which interestingly is when most of the brain reorganization takes place, do find some, you might normally get 20 out of 20 or 19 out of 20 on a test result. You might get 17 out of 20. So you might just drop a couple of marks. It's not clinical. It's not anything that we would worry about, but women are noticing that in their everyday life. Mm-hmm. There's also a big difference from going and sitting in a nice, calm, quiet cognitive testing lab with no distractions versus trying to do all of the things in everyday life. Yep. So third trimester, we find sometimes there are little aspects of different types of memory loss, but by the same token, there is some research being done that's found memory enhancement in the third trimester, particularly for instead of just remembering random items, remembering baby-related items, so things that you're kind of already paying attention to. So there's some data showing enhancement then as well. And the tests that have been done in motherhood, we're not really picking anything up at all. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty unclear. We can't say women become forgetful during pregnancy and motherhood. The data's not supporting that. The women are saying that they're feeling that. So how can we kind of interrogate that paradox? And that's when it gets really interesting. Because if we look at, say, a group of women who say they have baby brain, but their test scores are fine, there's quite a strong correlation there with overall well-being. So like, how are you getting enough sleep? Do you have lots of social support networks around you? Are you feeling like you're coping? Physically, how well are you? Mentally, how well you are? The higher someone scores on overall well-being, the less likely she is to rate her memory as bad. For instance, if she's scoring very poorly on overall well-being, she's much more likely to relate her memory as bad. And it's also important to think about memory. This is how I always explain it. It's not just like you've got memory, but you've got attention, and attention's kind of like a funnel that determines what information comes in and what to filter out. So when you've got a new baby and your brain has been reorganized to focus in on the baby, your brain hasn't been reorganized to also remember all of the things that you have to do in the workplace, to also remember the grocery list, to also remember where your kid put his shoes and who's got homework due and the dog needs to get vaccinated and all of the other things. It's primarily focusing in you and on the new baby. And you can't remember all of the things, but because we've been told, oh, baby brain, you'll become stupid and forgetful when you have a baby, women are blaming their own neurobiology for not remembering everything when it's not their brain that's letting them down. It's the support that she's not getting.
Yes.
You can't do all of the things. It's not that you can't do all of the things. You shouldn't be having to do all the things. Women who are well supported and nurtured and looked after and have lots and lots of support systems around them are much less likely to report baby brain because they're not trying to do all of the other stuff. They're only trying to look after the baby. So there's lots of sort of social aspects in this sort of narrative we have as well.
Yes, and I wondered if it was something like that, in a sense of I'm actually only going to remember the things that are most important to me at this point anyway. And that's why I'm subconsciously forgetting or not paying attention to some things.
Yeah, and you're especially if it's your first baby and you're in the third trimester, it's really hard to, like, you're constantly being reminded the baby's there. You're not sleeping. The baby's moving. It's full on. It's exciting. It's scary. You've constantly got this internal physical distraction inside you. So it is hard to focus and remember.
Yeah.
But, I don't suppose, Mother Nature intended us to be trying to do all of the things and all these expectations that we have on ourselves or responsibilities that we have. And it's interesting because throughout in baby brain, I spend a lot of time surveying my sort of audience and putting lots of questions out and getting information back. And I had a few women kind of respond saying that they didn't have baby brain and they had really good experiences. The two that I remember most clearly, that were like, so did you have baby brain? No, I had a great experience. Da, 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 da. And then both of them were expats living in Asia and they had live-in nannies and live-in help.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was like, well, there you go. That's we all need extra wives.
I know.
And extra help and extra and that was almost like, well, there we go, because they weren't trying to do absolutely everything as well as tend to their new little puppy.
Well, is there anything that we know about? Is there anything women can do to facilitate or nurture the changes that are going to happen in our brain already? Like, are there known factors that can interact with process of?
Well, I mean, the changes that take place structurally to do all the reorganisation are like driven by pregnancy hormones. So you probably have as much control over them as you do over, the onset of labour or how big your boobs grow, or that's a pretty biologically driven process. I mean, we can only but support ourselves in all of the other ways that we know how to make sure, you've got, sleep and you've got lots of good food and all of those kind of health and well-being things that we know would support us are also going to support our brain. I think once the baby arrives, then, I do talk about in baby brain, there's kind of like three kind of main themes in terms of women who have a easier time of it or healthier outcomes versus those that don't, who are around sleep and around social support, and then just this sort of self-identity. Mm-hmm. So sleep is really hard to come by. And that's when we're not, we didn't evolve to parent alone. We're co-parenting mammals, but we still think that we have to do it all. If there's some way to sort of share the care, you can't obviously do that if you're breastfeeding and you're trying to establish breastfeeding. But if there's some way to, there is a psychiatrist I spoke to in the book who says she gets her patients to like kind of do these really super detailed like maps and timetables of the day of every member in the family to kind of map out and plan out when there are times in which more sleep can be scheduled in.
Yeah.
Because if you've got more capacity for sleep, you've got more capacity for everything. Everything is harder without it. It's not necessarily easier with it, but it's harder without it. Understanding how sleep cycles work is also really important. And I know lots of new mums or women, like, the kids and the baby go to bed and then they don't want to go straight to bed because they just want some alone time. And the only time is at night when everyone else is asleep. But what we do know is when you fall asleep, the first sort of third of the night, or maybe the first 2 or 3 hours of the night, are when you fall into your deepest sleep, and that's your deep, restorative, healthy sleep. Now, when you fall into that and you're in deep, deep sleep, you've been asleep for like 1 hour and then the baby wakes up. It's so hard to wake up. But if you've got that locked in and then you move into your shallower sleep, your more dreamy sleep, and the baby wakes up and you've had 6 hours sleep, or even 5, it's much easier to wake up and it feels less disturbing. So if we can somehow, and if you're a single mum or by yourself, it's going to be very hard. But if you're not, then there are other adults who can help facilitate you getting that good solid block of those first few hours undisturbed sleep, because then everything is easier. But that requires like the cavalry, right? Those social support networks. And I wish that women didn't have to sort that out themselves.
Yes.
I wish it wasn't up to the women to ensure that there was the people there to help, because that's another thing that we have to organise.
Yeah, that's right.
But that's our lot, it seems, sometimes, that we also have to ensure that we have organised the helpers instead of them being embedded or organised.
Yeah. Well, we have to reorganise society so that we can prioritise our brain reorganisation. Of course, we're responsible for that. But in your book, you talk about in baby brain that the major changes happen in the maternal brain in the 3rd trimester, you were saying.
The biggest structural reorganisation changes, And we think that then the brain becomes very plastic, which just means it's like really easy for it to learn by experience.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I kind of think it puts you in this state where the learning curve isn't so steep as it would be as if the new baby arrived and you haven't gone through that pregnancy.
Yeah. And you touched on it earlier. If that process is interrupted, so let's say even hypothetically, a woman has her baby at 32 weeks or 34 weeks or earlier than a full gestation. Like, we already know about the impact of early term birth on a baby's brain. Do we know anything about the impact on a woman's brain? Sarah's shaking her head. For anybody
no, we haven't got that data. We haven't got that research in yet. I think it would be ethically quite difficult to, you've got a mum who's given birth to a baby who's 12 weeks preemie. Can we scan your brain?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to know.
I'm not sure we haven't got that data yet. That doesn't mean it's not going to turn up. I'm just trying to think of the ethics and the logistics of getting those new mums who are going to be so vulnerable anyway. They're going to have to be pretty altruistic to want to offer themselves up, just have their brains scanned, just say, can we see what happened to your brain when you've had a preemie baby or you've lost a baby? We don't know. The only data that we do, there's some data, because women are often, rightly so, interested in what happens if they lost a baby very early in pregnancy.
Yeah.
So there is some cool research, that's very sparse, looking at this phenomenon of microchimerism, because the placenta isn't just like kind of a wall between the mother and the baby. It's kind of like this biological interface that allows some things through and not others. And it does allow some of the baby's cells to come into your bloodstream, which now we kind of understand, because now I think like you can even get a blood test to find out the sex of your baby. Is that correct? And also people don't understand the placenta has a biological sex. You've got to, because it's from this fertilized egg. and then half of it becomes the baby, the other half becomes a placenta. So you've got a male placenta or a female placenta, which I think is very interesting. And we think the male placentas may be slightly more vulnerable to like insult or, stress or whatever in utero, which is why male babies are slightly more vulnerable to neurodevelopmental disorders. And they're often born a little bit smaller, and they're often, little girls are often a little bit more robust at birth than little boys. It might be to do with the biological sex of the placenta, but that's pretty new research, but I think it's fascinating. But anyway, the placenta, male or female, does allow the passage of cells through. And some of these fetal cells, because they're so immature, they're almost like stem cells, and they can kind of embed all throughout your body and your brain and your heart and your lungs, and then can be detected throughout your life because they all kind of become integrated and become like a functional part of you. So if you had a male baby, even if you lost it very early, there are some cases where older women, autopsies have been done or tissue been taken. Obviously, you can't take tissue from your brain when you're still alive. That has got XY chromosome, like these individual cells just kind of specked through that have got XY chromosomes that came because she had a male pregnancy.
Yes.
And then sometimes the woman was like, well, I only had daughters. And they were like, well, did you ever lose a pregnancy? And she will have, and it would have been a male.
Yes.
So there is this lovely idea that you carry a little bit of each of your child within you, even if you lost them. So It may not have completely reorganized your brain, but there's still a little bit, which who knows what the kind of what's the adaptive evolutionary benefit for that? Maybe there's not one for everything. Yeah. Maybe it's just so when we found out, it comforted us.
Yeah. Yes.
I think I'm going to go with that. I once posted about that on Instagram, and someone said, oh, we should be far more scientific, and I think you're making far more of that. And I was like, oh, well, if it makes someone feel better who's lost a pregnancy, then so
but
be
I think each pregnancy and each baby does change us as people. And, and I've heard people say, and it's true, even a mother of a baby who didn't survive is still a mother because
100%, you
had a baby,
Yeah.
But you did, and you alluded to, just when we interrupt that change by either a preterm birth or miscarriage, or, pre-labor cesarean section, that there's, I guess, a loss of that finishing off of the transformation that happens in women's brain.
So the research is just this kind of one study that's looked at, is there a difference between the method of delivery? So if someone went through labour versus not, and the changes are kind of, but it's not massive, but you can pick it up. The structural changes are kind of greater in the woman who had labour and delivery. So there's something about that biological process which kind of, they called it the final push, which kind of also changes that brain structurally.
Yeah. When Dr. Sarah Buckley, who does a lot of research on oxytocin, talks about the hormonal gap of cesarean section, where there is that oxytocin gap. But then there's been some research in the oxytocin field that talks about how you can fill hormonal gap. And for women who've had cesarean sections, they can fill the oxytocin gap by things like extended skin-to-skin and breastfeeding.
Yeah, because breastfeeding, is a pretty. I mean, you've got oxytocin and prolactin kind of working together.
Yeah.
For however many years you want to breastfeed. So I think there is that like kind of gap, but I think, I reckon the dose of oxytocin could be eventually accumulated if you were breastfeeding or with skin to skin. And there's plenty of people who are wonderful, amazing parents who didn't give birth. I just think we need to be careful about how we present the data, because some people can get quite, people tend to personalise this kind of stuff, and you have to be compassionate.
Of course. Does it change each pregnancy? Like, do we get cumulative changes? If we have more babies, do our brains get better and better and better? Or is it just...
No, I think the biggest change is that first pregnancy, and most of the research, and that's where some of the like earlier sort of studies looking, mucked up the research a bit because they were sometimes looking at first-time mothers, sometimes looking at women that had 3 or 4 babies, and they weren't like doing the science very carefully. But it does appear the biggest change is that first pregnancy,
Right.
like that's your brain is now a mother, and the pregnancies after that, there doesn't seem to be the same massive reorganization. And it's also interesting because there's been a little bit of research looking at kind of those early stages, those kind of first few weeks of motherhood, when particularly with the first baby, you're very, very hypervigilant as well, and your nervous system is kind of quite dialed up. Also, possibly because you haven't quite figured out how to look after the baby yet, so it doesn't want you to like forget the baby's there, so you're like really on. And how that manifests is all of those intrusive thoughts that so many of us had, particularly with our first, the baby's going to fall down the stairs or out the window or on the floor or out of the car, or we just are filled with like the disaster scenarios. I guess it's almost like we're trying to rehearse how to keep the baby safe.
Yeah.
And our mind is trying to make meaning of the fact that we're very, very hypervigilant, which I think is, again, a kind of an adaptive mechanism to keep us on while we're figuring out this motherhood business. Because people don't typically have it as much for second or third or subsequent babies. We don't see women reporting the same feelings of catastrophe and having the same intrusive thoughts, and also we don't see that same nervous system kind of hypervigilance. And the kind of the thing that's really important is that you typically should kind of dial off over kind of weeks or months, and if it doesn't, that's a very strong risk factor for developing postnatal anxiety and then depression.
Right. So
yeah, because it's completely normal.
Yeah.
But you hope that you're not still 6 months later consumed with the thought about something terrible happening to your baby every minute of the day. It's pretty normal in the first few weeks.
So we're initially dialed in and wired to be hypervigilant to the safety of our babies, but it should peter off over time.
And it's not as usually as strong with the second baby.
Right.
You usually are just a bit more like casual, and then I'm sure once you get up to baby 3 or 4 or 5, they don't probably, you would never consider that they would fall out the window. Because by then, you know what to do. You know how to keep them safe.
Yeah. And in your book, you talked about the maternal motivation system, and we know how our brains change, but why do they change? How does this change benefit the woman and the baby? And, you've alluded to the fact that our brain has to change so that we are wired to care for our newborns.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's, and I've tried to be really careful with a lot of the language because, and I kind of wanted to go a bit deeper and kind of interrogate it, I suppose, in terms of these ideas about maternal instinct and maternal motivations and maternal behaviours, because you don't want to assume that simply because you had a pregnancy that you know how to look after the baby and you're going to be a brilliant mother, because we have to figure it out. Not everyone is. And I often get people say to me, well, my mother was neglectful or abusive and she carried me. Like, why didn't her brain make her look after me appropriately? And that's because like so much of that is, as I say, needs to also be learned. But I was really interested in some of these ideas around maternal instinct and the motivations to care and what they mean. So first of all, I just wanted to sort of survey everyone, asking them what does that word even mean? And it has very diverse meanings for people. Some people mean it to be I wanted, desperately wanted to have a baby before I had one, that kind of almost like biological clock. Yeah. Some people like, I never wanted a baby, so I never had one. Other people like, I desperately wanted to have babies and I knew. So some people take that to mean maternal instinct. Others took it to mean like the moment you first laid eyes on your baby, what that felt like, and whether you were like, I knew I loved them I knew who they were straight away. Whereas other people are like, oh no shit, like they had no feeling, like they're just detached, which is also normal. And then others took it to mean down the track, you've got a kid coming home from school and they walk in the door and they've had a terrible day before you've even consciously registered that. You just feel it in your chest because you're a mother and that's your maternal instinct. So I was kind of interested in understanding all of those different meanings and what we understand about the biology under them. And then humans are so complicated and we vary so much. We bring our own stories and our histories and everyone else's tales, and we know quite a lot about the maternal brain from other animals. Mice and rats in particular are super interesting because and they did this. I talk about this one study where they developed this kind of mouse pup delivery system. So one of the main kind of maternal behaviours that rodents display is kind of they gather their pups up from wherever they are in a lab, it's in a cage, kind of bring them all together in the nest, and then if you put a pup in different parts of the cup, they'll just always constantly be gathering the pups. And sometimes they'll be doing so much gathering that they'll see their own tail and they'll gather the tail, and they'll see their own foot and they'll gather their own foot. And so this researcher years ago developed this pup delivery system whereby he every time the mother kind of gathered the pups in, we would kind of put them in this delivery chute. And so, he said and she would gather the pup, and then the pup would go back in the chute and gather the pup. So there was this constant conveyor belt of her few little pups. And he said the experiment stopped because he got bored and tired. She kept gathering and gathering and gathering. And so she was just utterly motivated and driven to nurture and care for her babies. And then they would do things like put electrical grids. So she would get electrical shocks on the way to get the pups, and she would still go and get electrical shocks to gather the pups back. So, as mammalian mothers are very, very, very driven to care and nurture and keep theirs safe, and different mammals have different ways of deploying those behaviours. So a dolphin mother isn't going to be gathering her babies, but a large part of the maternal behaviours, like a mother dolphin and a baby dolphin, will be about recognising each other's like squeaks. So, there's a lot of auditory recognition there. And herding animals like sheep. So, a herd of flock of 100 sheep, and 20 of them gave birth on the same day. So how's the mother know the mother and the baby go together? Well, that's all about smell recognition. So the mother learns the smell of her baby lamb as she has her process of labour and delivery puts her olfactory brain in this massive state of plasticity and learning. And as she's like licking all of the birth fluids and, the placenta and everything off her baby, she learns her baby's smell. And then the baby learns who she is basically by default. He just goes randomly around all the mums, and then the one that's not his mum kicks him away or ignores him, and he learns which one's his mum because she's the only one that pays him attention. So there's different animals, depending on the ecology, will deploy different behaviours and will be motivated to behave in certain ways.
Yeah.
We, all humans everywhere on the whole planet, are very motivated and driven to respond to babies' cries. So everywhere in the world, if the baby cries, we've got to pick it up and we cuddle it and stop it crying. That seems to be almost one of our maternal behaviours that we deploy. And we love cute things. We love cute puppies. We love cute cartoons. We love, big eyes. And there's this whole field of study about cuteness and how we are driven towards cuteness. And babies are super cute. They smell cute. They sound cute, which is good because they are really annoying and disruptive and make life very difficult, but we're still driven to care for them despite everything, all the chaos that they bring.
Well, and you mentioned in your book that, and I've written a sentence here that I wanted to remember, that pregnancy triggers neuroanatomical adaptations that prepare a woman's reward circuit to maximally respond to cues of her infant, thereby increasing the incentive value of their newborn. So they get like a dopamine hit, and it's an addictive process to respond to your baby.
Yeah, it does. They are almost addictive. And that smell that a newborn baby has, because the smell is, and so we've got all of these cues which just make us want them. And so the reward system essentially teaches us what was really good or bad last time, so we do it again or don't do it again. And so the first few times you experience something that's just so like smell of a new baby, it's just so, you could eat them. It's so captivating and it's just feels so good that you're just like constantly then driven to your baby. And that's despite there being aversive cues like their pooey nappies and they're crying and you're sleep deprived and the chaos, that they have something that's that our maternal brain, part of that plastic process, makes our reward system so super sensitive to the tiniest little reward we get from them. We will respond despite the aversion. And that's perhaps what could go wrong. And, you know, some women who don't attach properly, especially women who some really interesting work's been done over many years from a group in Israel looking at women who, like say, have serious depression and give birth to their baby, even from day sort of 1, 2, 3 in the hospital. They've been studied and they won't necessarily, they'll find early motherhood hard and they won't necessarily as attached to the baby as closely. And they're able to kind of see those consequences play out if there's no intervention. So, you know, it's really important to understand what are these drives and what is happening. So when it goes wrong, we can intervene early and there's not long-term consequences.
So then we know like the pregnancy changes that happen in our brain kind of prime us to parent our baby. Does the act of parenting change our brains? What impact is there on the non-birthing parents, or if you're fostering or adopting, or if you're just baby through surrogacy or something?
Yeah. So that's super interesting. So the first sort of look was at the dads, the male partners of the mothers from that first study. And initially, in comparison to the mothers, it was like there's no change. Like the mothers' brains were the change was so big. The fathers were just like flatline. But then like they looked just at the fathers and they got some more data and they kind of looked more closely. And then when you just looked at that data set, you were able to see, oh, there are some like subtle differences between different dads. And it's kind of interesting because the degree of change seen in the brain is what we would call dose responsive. So how much they parent, so how much interaction they have with the baby, how hands-on they are as a father, and they've kind of quantified the degree of care or involvement. And obviously, you know, males can, you know, the father can be there for conception only and never be seen again, or he could be the primary caregiver. And so the more caregiving that is done, the greater the change, which like the more, like, you know, you hit a golf ball once versus being a professional golfer, your brain will be different. So we see that with anything. The more you perform any task, the more changes you'll see. Are the changes like super specific towards caregiving, or are they just changes that have come about by performing a task regularly? Is kind of, I suppose, where we're at and what we're trying to figure out, because there's very different parts of the brain change in the males. I haven't looked closely yet because the data came out when I was in Antarctica on the lesbian mums and to see, but I know that there's not a significant change in comparison to the birth mothers. I don't know if they've compared those non-birthing mothers to the fathers. They have done some study comparing like adoptive mothers versus birth mothers in terms of not looking at structure, but like doing EEG, so putting like a cap on and recording brain waves. And that's pretty interesting because that's showing the response to the baby is the same. You couldn't differentiate between the two. So, you know, the adopted mums loved the babies just as much as the birth mums. So that was really nice, that research. But you know, it's so new. All this work is just sort of coming out.
Yes. That's so interesting. I mean, I feel like those are the questions I had from just my reading of one of your books, Baby Brain. Do you feel like there's anything we haven't touched on in the work that's in there? Yes.
I think it's a very exciting time. I touched very briefly, I suppose. What we haven't really talked about is that the kind of the long-term effects of motherhood and parenting on the brain, and that we definitely see traces of pregnancy or motherhood in the brains of women, and much, you know, even women in their 80s. Now we've got big data sets, we've got machine learning and AI. We can ask some pretty sophisticated questions and do some pretty sophisticated data analysis that we couldn't do years ago. And so now, AI is able to pretty reliably say mother, not mother, mother, not mother, even in someone who was in their 80s. So the traces last. There is a little bit of research suggesting that women who have had a pregnancy and raised children are perhaps slightly protected against unhealthy brain aging or against dementia. It doesn't stop you getting it. It just lowers your risk slightly so long as you don't have more than 4 babies. And we don't know whether that's the big doses of hormones of pregnancy, because the dose of estrogen you get in one pregnancy is greater than the dose that you get in the entire rest of your life combined. So that's a very significant amount of hormone that you're receiving in one go. And we don't know whether those massive doses, if you have 3 or 4 babies, build resilience against aging, or whether it's motherhood and like all of the constant up-leveling and gamification of your family that you have to do that is like building cognitive reserve. But once women have more than 4 babies, that sort of benefit seems to wash away, but that could be because having more than 4 is really stressful.
And malnourishing sometimes, have that amount of pressure on your body. And
100%, yeah. So we're starting to, so there's lots of interesting sort of research emerging.
I think it's really exciting. A new research focus, and thankfully on women, and at this really important stage of our lives. Thank you for writing the books. I know it probably felt really challenging at the time, but we appreciate it because now we.
The second one was Baby Rain was fun to write. I think the challenge was the first book because I'd never done it before.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second, it was like, after that, I was like, I'm never doing this again. It was exactly like having a baby. Then after about 2 years, I could do that again. Like I kind of that after all. So the second time was much easier because I knew what was happening. But it's fun. But now I'm on long service leave.
I'm
on a long break.
I'm going to put the names and links to your books underneath in the show notes of the podcast, and so people can click on through and find any of Sarah's stuff if this is of interest to you. She's having a break, but you can still consume all of her books.
Yeah,
and you'll get more of the story as well. We kind of glazed over as much as we could in this episode, but for all the details, have a look at her books there, and they will be in the show notes. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It was great fun. I like the vibe. It's good.
Vibe. People seem to like it. We try. Amazing. Well, that's been this episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast, and we will see you next week.
To get access to the resources for each podcast episode, join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com, and to support the work of this podcast, wear the rebellion in the form of clothing and other merch at thegreatbirthrebellion.com. Follow me, Mel, at Melanie the Midwife on socials, and the show at The Great Birth Rebellion. All the details are in the show notes.